The champagne flute trembled in my hand as I watched my husband raise his glass across the candlelit table, his smile carrying the same warmth that had fooled me for 7 years. Behind him, through the restaurant's etched glass partition, I could see her waiting at the bar, nervously checking her phone every few seconds, unaware that the drink meant for me would soon be sliding across her table instead. They thought I was stupid, thought the mysterious illness that had plagued me for months had dulled my senses enough that I wouldn't notice the bitter aftertaste in every anniversary gift, every reconciliation dinner, every toast to our future. But when you discover your husband has been slowly poisoning you while planning a new life with his mistress, you learn that sometimes the best revenge isn't just survival, it's letting them poison each other with their own treachery. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Veronica Chen, and until 6 months ago I believed I was living a charmed life in our waterfront home in Seattle's Magnolia neighborhood. The morning everything changed started like any other, with me reaching for my coffee cup on the marble kitchen counter, while my husband Nathan prepared for another day at his biotech firm. He'd already poured my usual vanilla latte, the foam decorated with a delicate leaf pattern that spoke of his attention to detail, his supposed devotion to making my morning special. The first sip tasted wrong. Not obviously wrong, just slightly off in a way I couldn't quite identify, like someone had added an extra drop of vanilla or used a different brand of syrup. I mentioned it casually, the way you might comment on any minor household change, expecting him to laugh about trying a new coffee blend or forgetting the usual measurement. Instead, Nathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression I might have missed if I hadn't been looking directly at him. The taste is fine, Veronica. You've been paranoid about everything lately. Maybe you should mention these imaginations to Dr. Marsh at your next appointment. His voice carried that particular blend of concern and condescension that had become his signature tone over the past few months, ever since my mysterious symptoms had started. The symptoms had begun subtly in January, just after the holiday. Fatigue that sleep couldn't cure, headaches that medication couldn't touch, a persistent nausea that made me push away plates of food I'd previously loved. At first I'd blamed stress from managing my interior design firm, the pressure of landing the waterfront plaza renovation project, the usual chaos of modern life, but as weeks turned into months and the symptoms intensified rather than improved, even I had to admit something was genuinely wrong. Nathan had been the perfect supportive husband, scheduling doctor's appointments, researching specialists, holding my hair back during the increasingly frequent episodes of violent illness. He'd even started working from home more often, claiming he wanted to be there in case I needed him. The devoted husband, everyone said. So lucky to have him. They all agreed. My own mother had called him a saint for putting up with what she termed my difficult phase. Dr. Marsh, the internist Nathan had found for me, ran every test imaginable: blood work, MRIs, CT scans, endoscopies. Everything came back frustratingly normal, except for slightly elevated inflammation markers and trace amounts of what he called environmental toxins, probably from the renovation sites I frequented for work. He'd prescribed vitamins, suggested stress management techniques, and gently hinted that perhaps some of my symptoms were psychosomatic. The coffee incident should have been nothing, a minor blip in the landscape of larger health concerns. But something about Nathan's reaction lodged in my mind like a splinter, small but impossible to ignore. That evening, while he attended a conference call in his home office, I found myself examining the coffee canister, the vanilla syrup, even the milk carton, looking for anything unusual. Everything appeared normal, pristine even, as if recently replaced. My best friend Diane thought I was being ridiculous when I mentioned it during our weekly lunch at the Pike Place Market. "You're looking for problems where none exist," she said, spearing a piece of grilled salmon with perhaps more force than necessary. "Nathan adores you. He's been nothing but supportive through this whole health crisis. Maybe Dr. Marsh is right about the stress. When was the last time you took a real break from work?" But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like a painting hung slightly crooked that only you seemed to notice. The feeling intensified over the following weeks, as I began paying closer attention to patterns I'd previously overlooked. Nathan always prepared my morning coffee, insisting it was his way of taking care of me. He'd become oddly particular about cooking dinner, especially on the nights when my symptoms would later flare. He'd started buying my favorite wine in bulk, always having a glass ready when I came home from work, watching intently as I took the first sip. The turning point came on a Thursday evening in early March. I'd left work early, another wave of dizziness forcing me to hand off a client meeting to my assistant. Instead of going straight home, I stopped at a small cafe in Fremont, needing time to collect myself before facing Nathan's oppressive concern. As I sat nursing a green tea, my phone buzzed with a text from him asking when I'd be home. Dinner was almost ready. He'd made my favorite mushroom risotto. Something made me lie. Stuck in traffic, I typed back, "Accident on 99. Be home in an hour." I drove home anyway, parking down the street and approaching our house on foot. Through the kitchen window, I watched Nathan moving around with practiced efficiency. He had 2 plates set out, the risotto already served, a glass of wine poured at my place setting. But it was what he did next that made my blood run cold. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a small vial, carefully measuring drops of clear liquid into my wine glass. He swirled it gently, ensuring it mixed completely, then returned the vial to his pocket and checked his phone, presumably reading my text about the traffic delay. I stood frozen in my own garden, watching my husband of 7 years carefully dose my dinner with something that was clearly not meant to enhance the flavor. My mind raced through possibilities, each more horrifying than the last, while my body remained paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what I was witnessing. This was Nathan, the man who'd cried at our wedding, who'd held my hand through my father's funeral, who'd spent 3 days building the perfect home office for my business. Nathan, who was methodically poisoning me. I must have stood there for 10 minutes, maybe more, before survival instinct kicked in. I couldn't go inside, couldn't pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. Instead, I walked back to my car on unsteady legs and drove to a parking lot 3 blocks away. My hands shook as I called him, manufacturing a story about the client meeting running late, suggesting we postpone dinner. His disappointment seemed genuine, the concern in his voice indistinguishable from real emotion. That night I stayed at the office, claiming a deadline that couldn't wait. I spent the hours until dawn researching on my laptop, clearing my search history as I went, paranoid even about digital traces. The symptoms I'd been experiencing aligned horrifyingly well with several types of poisoning: chronic, low-dose exposure designed to mimic natural illness, untraceable in standard medical tests unless specifically looking for them, the kind of poisoning that spoke of careful planning, medical knowledge, and a long-term goal. Nathan's biotech background suddenly took on new significance. His insistence on managing my medical care felt less like devotion and more like control. The way he'd steered me toward Dr. Marsh, a doctor who seemed predisposed to dismiss my concerns as stress-related, appeared calculated rather than caring. Even our recent life insurance discussion, where he'd suggested increasing my policy given my health issues, now seemed sinister rather than sensible. I needed proof beyond what I'd witnessed, evidence that couldn't be dismissed as the paranoid delusions of a sick woman. But more importantly, I needed to understand why. What could drive Nathan to slowly poison the woman he claimed to love? The answer to that question would come sooner than expected, delivered not through investigation, but through sheer horrible coincidence. 2 days after witnessing the poisoning, I'd managed to avoid most meals with Nathan, claiming nausea, and existing on protein bars hidden in my office. He seemed frustrated but not suspicious, increasing his hovering attention in ways that made my skin crawl. That Saturday he suggested lunch at Canlis, the upscale restaurant overlooking Lake Union, where we'd celebrated our engagement years ago. The irony of returning to the site of our beginning while he plotted my ending wasn't lost on me. I agreed, partly because refusing would raise suspicions, partly because public spaces felt safer. He couldn't dose my food in a crowded restaurant without risk of being seen. What I hadn't counted on was her being there. We'd barely been seated when I spotted her across the dining room. Rachel Morrison, the new marketing director at Nathan's company, 32, Harvard MBA, with the kind of effortless beauty that made other women feel like they were trying too hard. She was dining alone, but her table was set for 2, and she kept glancing toward the entrance with anticipation that seemed familiar. Nathan's reaction when he followed my gaze confirmed what my instincts were already screaming. The slight stiffening of his shoulders. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The too casual way he suggested we move to a different table with better views, the sudden intense interest in his menu, all the microscopic tells of a man seeing his mistress when he shouldn't. The lunch passed in a surreal haze. Nathan played the devoted husband perfectly, asking about my health, discussing weekend plans, even reaching across the table to hold my hand in a gesture that would have seemed romantic to any observer, but I could see the performance now, could recognize the script he was following. Meanwhile, Rachel had been joined by a female friend, though she kept shooting glances our way when she thought I wasn't looking. After lunch, Nathan suggested a walk along the waterfront, but I begged off, claiming fatigue. He drove me home, solicitous as always, making sure I was comfortable before mentioning he needed to go to the office for a few hours. Weekend work, he explained apologetically, a project deadline that couldn't wait. I watched from our bedroom window as his car disappeared around the corner, then grabbed my keys and followed. He didn't go to the office. Instead, he drove to a modern apartment complex in Capitol Hill, using a key fob to enter the building's garage. I waited outside, my suspicions crystallizing into certainty when Rachel's white Audi pulled into the same garage. 20 minutes later, the equation was horrifyingly simple now. Husband plus mistress plus systematic poisoning equaled a murder plot dressed up as natural causes. But knowing and proving were different things, and surviving required more than just evidence. It demanded strategy, patience, and a performance of my own that would make Nathan's devoted husband act look like community theater. The game had changed, but he didn't know it yet. He still thought he was playing solitaire while I was already 3 moves into chess. The research phase began that night while Nathan spent 4 hours at Rachel's apartment. I'd discovered the wonders of private browsing mode and VPN services, tools that would let me investigate without leaving digital footprints. What I found painted a picture more disturbing than simple infidelity and attempted murder. Rachel Morrison wasn't just Nathan's mistress, she was his future, meticulously planned and funded by my impending death. Financial records I accessed through our joint accounts showed subtle but significant changes over the past year. Investments moved into Nathan's name alone, property deeds adjusted, beneficiary designations updated on everything except the life insurance that would pay out upon my death. He'd been building a financial fortress while slowly demolishing my physical one. The timeline aligned perfectly with when my symptoms had started, suggesting this wasn't a crime of passion but a carefully orchestrated execution. Rachel's social media provided its own revelation. 6 months of photos showing a gradual lifestyle inflation that her marketing director salary couldn't support, designer handbags appearing with increasing frequency, weekend trips to Aspen and Cabo, a new apartment in one of Seattle's most expensive neighborhoods. The captions were carefully crafted to suggest hard work paying off. But the timeline told a different story. Her upgrade began precisely when my downgrade started. The most damning discovery came from a forgotten email account Nathan and I had shared during our engagement. He'd stopped using it years ago, but like many people, he'd never changed the password. There, in the drafts folder, I found their communication, not full emails, just drafts written and read but never sent, a technique that avoided creating an email trail. Their plans laid out in horrible detail, discussing my declining health with clinical detachment, debating timelines with the casualness of planning a vacation. She's lasting longer than expected, Rachel had written in one draft dated 3 weeks ago. The doctor visits are getting suspicious. Maybe we need to accelerate. Nathan's response chilled me more than Seattle's perpetual rain. Patience, natural progression is key. Too fast raises questions. The conference in May provides perfect cover for the final phase. The conference in May, 2 months away, a biotech symposium in Vancouver that Nathan attended annually. He'd already mentioned I should skip it this year given my health, that he'd be too busy with presentations to properly take care of me. Now I understood. My death was scheduled for May, timed to occur while he had an airtight alibi hundreds of miles away. The smart thing would have been to go to the police immediately, show them the drafts, the financial records, the evidence I'd gathered, but I knew how it would look. A sick woman, diagnosed with stress-related illness, making wild accusations against her supportive husband based on drafts that could be interpreted as fantasy, financial moves that could be explained as prudent planning, and a mistress who could simply be a friend. Without proof of the actual poisoning, I'd be dismissed as delusional, maybe even committed for my own safety. Nathan had constructed the perfect framework for my destruction, so instead, I decided to play a longer game. If Nathan could perform the devoted husband while plotting murder, I could perform the dying wife while planning justice. The first step was confirming the poison itself. Through careful observation, I identified the pattern. The doses came primarily through dinner meals Nathan prepared, and morning coffee he insisted on making. Weekends were highest risk when he had more control over my food intake. Wine was a favorite vehicle, its strong flavor masking any chemical taste. I started a secret journal, documenting every symptom, every meal, every dose I suspected, but more importantly, I began selectively avoiding the poisoned items. A developed lactose intolerance explained rejecting morning lattes. Intermittent fasting became my excuse for skipping dinner. When forced to eat Nathan's cooking, I'd mastered the art of moving food around my plate, taking tiny bites, then disposing of the rest when he wasn't looking. The improvement in my health was immediate, though I had to hide it, continuing to perform illness, even as my strength returned. Nathan grew frustrated with my dietary changes but couldn't argue against them without seeming unsupportive. He adapted, trying new methods, protein shakes for my health, vitamin supplements he'd researched, even aromatherapy diffusers in our bedroom filled with essential oils that made me genuinely ill, until I learned to hold my breath and switch them off when he left. Each escalation revealed more of his desperation as May approached, and I stubbornly refused to deteriorate on schedule. During this time, I cultivated my own information network. Diana, my best friend, noticed my improved health during lunches Nathan didn't know about. I swore her to secrecy, claiming I didn't want to jinx my recovery by talking about it. My assistant at the design firm became my alibi creator, covering for afternoon absences when I was actually consulting with a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud. My lawyer, approached under the guise of updating my will given my health issues, began documenting everything in legally protected files. The private investigator, a former FBI agent named Marcus Webb, proved invaluable. He discovered things I'd missed in my amateur investigation. Nathan's medical research at the biotech firm included access to compounds that could induce my exact symptoms. Security footage showed him entering restricted labs at unusual hours. Most damning, Marcus found the supply chain. Nathan had been ordering the compounds through a shell company, having them delivered to a private mailbox across town. The paper trail was thin but present for someone who knew where to look. Marcus also uncovered the depth of Rachel's involvement. She wasn't just a mistress waiting in the wings, she was an active participant. Her laptop, which Marcus legally accessed during a scheduled repair at a shop he had connections with, contained research on inheritance law, life insurance policies, and tellingly, symptoms of various toxins. One document, hidden in a folder labeled with random numbers, contained what appeared to be a timeline mapping my expected decline against their major milestones. First vacation together planned for June, 2 months after my projected death. Wedding tentatively scheduled for the following spring. A respectful year of mourning completed. The violation of reading their plans for the life they'd built on my grave was overwhelming, but it also fueled a cold fury that crystallized into purpose. They weren't going to get away with it. Not the money, not the life together, not the freedom they thought my death would buy them, but stopping them required more than evidence. It required turning their own weapon against them in a way they'd never see coming. The plan formed slowly, pieces clicking into place like the renovation designs I created for clients. Nathan and Rachel thought they were working with a simple blueprint: poison the wife, inherit the money, live happily ever after. They didn't realize I'd been redesigning their structure from the inside, creating load-bearing weaknesses that would bring everything crashing down at exactly the right moment. April arrived with its usual Seattle rain and the increasing pressure of Nathan's timeline. His frustration with my failure to decline had become palpable. He'd started suggesting more aggressive medical interventions, even researching clinical trials for mysterious illnesses that would require me to be hospitalized for treatment. The subtext was clear: if I wouldn't die conveniently at home, he'd find a medical setting where my death would raise even fewer questions. It was during one of these tense discussions about treatment options that I played my first card. I'd discovered a wonderful new wellness center, I told him, run by a doctor who specialized in cases like mine. Dr. Sarah Chen came highly recommended, and had already agreed to take me on as a patient. Nathan's expression cycled through surprise, suspicion and calculation before settling on supportive enthusiasm. Of course he wanted me to explore every option for recovery. He'd even drive me to appointments if needed. What Nathan didn't know was that Dr. Chen was an old college friend who'd left traditional medicine to study toxicology. Her wellness center was real, but my appointments were cover for having blood and hair samples properly tested for the specific compounds Marcus had identified in Nathan's laboratory access logs. The results confirmed what I'd suspected: chronic exposure to a cocktail of substances designed to mimic autoimmune disorders while slowly shutting down organ function. Ingenious in its complexity, deadly in its intent. Dr. Chen wanted to go to the authorities immediately, but I convinced her to wait. The evidence was still largely circumstantial, and Nathan's plan included contingencies I was still uncovering. One rushed move could give him time to destroy evidence, or worse, accelerate his timeline through more direct means. Instead, she agreed to document everything meticulously, while providing me with supplements that would help counteract the poison's effects without being obvious about it. The supplements worked perhaps too well. By mid-April I was feeling stronger than I had in months, forcing me to perform increasing weakness to maintain Nathan's timeline. I'd mastered the art of stumbling slightly, of letting my hands shake at strategic moments, of allowing exhaustion to show in my eyes even when energy coursed through my body. Nathan watched me like a scientist observing a lab rat, noting every symptom with satisfaction that he couldn't quite hide. Rachel, meanwhile, had grown bolder. She'd started appearing at the same restaurants where Nathan and I dined, always with plausible explanations. She'd joined the same gym I attended, though my mysterious illness had supposedly prevented me from working out in months. Once I caught her in our neighborhood, walking past our house with the studied casualness of someone definitely not conducting surveillance. The vultures were circling, eager for their feast. It was Nathan's suggestion that we renew our vows for our upcoming 8th anniversary that finally pushed me to accelerate my own timeline. The ceremony would be in early May, he proposed, just before his conference, a small gathering of family and friends to celebrate our love surviving through difficult times. The perversion of it, planning to recommit to me weeks before my scheduled death, demonstrated a sadism I hadn't previously credited him with. He wanted the sympathy points of a devoted husband who'd lost his wife shortly after reaffirming their bond. I agreed enthusiastically, even suggesting we have the ceremony at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel where we'd held our original reception. Nathan loved the idea, already calculating how the tragic irony would play in the aftermath. What he didn't know was that I'd already begun my own preparations for that event, ones that would ensure it became memorable for entirely different reasons than he planned. The vow renewal became my deadline. Everything had to be in place by then, every piece of evidence secured, every contingency planned for. Marcus intensified his investigation, following money trails that led to offshore accounts Nathan had established for his post-murder life. Dr. Chen completed her toxicology reports with the kind of detail that would make prosecution inevitable. My lawyer prepared documents that would protect my assets regardless of what happened, and I practiced my performance, the grieving wife who'd discovered her husband's betrayal in the most horrific way possible. But the universe has a sense of humor about plans, even the best laid ones. 2 weeks before the ceremony, Nathan came home with champagne and news that would accelerate everything. The conference had been moved up due to a speaker conflict. Instead of late May, it would begin the day after our vow renewal. Wasn't that perfect timing? He asked, eyes bright with what I now recognized as anticipation. We could celebrate our love, then he'd leave for Vancouver while I recovered from the emotional expenditure. I smiled and said it was indeed perfect timing, though for very different reasons than he imagined. The compressed schedule meant adjusting everything, but it also meant Nathan would be operating under pressure,
more likely to make mistakes. He'd have to dose me heavily at the renewal ceremony itself to ensure I declined rapidly enough during his absence. Public poisoning carried more risks than his careful home campaign.
Risks that could be exploited if one knew they were coming. That night, while Nathan slept beside me in our king-sized bed, I lay awake finalizing the details of what would happen at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. He thought he was directing a tragedy where I played the dying victim. He didn't realize I'd rewritten the script entirely. In my version, the victim became the victor, the murderer became the exposed, and the mistress, poor Rachel, discovered that some roles come with unexpected consequences. The champagne flutes would be crystal, I decided. The toast would be public, witnessed by everyone who mattered. And when the moment came to drink to our eternal love, well, that's when the real performance would begin. Nathan had taught me through months of careful poisoning that sometimes the most elegant revenge came in a familiar glass, served with a smile, and swallowed by someone who never saw it coming. But first, I had preparations to complete, evidence to secure, and a husband to keep believing he was winning a game I'd already finished playing. The countdown to the Fairmont had begun, and with it, the final act of a marriage that had become a battlefield where only one of us would walk away victorious. Nathan thought he'd been writing my obituary. Instead, he'd been dictating his own confession, one poisoned sip at a time. The Fairmont Olympic Hotel's ballroom glowed with soft candlelight as our guests began arriving for what they believed was a celebration of enduring love. I stood before the full-length mirror in the bridal suite, adjusting the sapphire necklace Nathan had given me for our first anniversary, back when his gifts didn't come with hidden agendas and chemical additives. My reflection showed a woman who appeared fragile from months of illness, but whose eyes held a sharpness that careful makeup couldn't entirely conceal. Diana helped me with the final touches, her hands gentle but her expression troubled. She'd been my co-conspirator these past weeks, one of the few who knew the truth about my improving health and the reason for this elaborate charade. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" she whispered, glancing toward the door as if Nathan might materialize at any moment. "There are other ways to handle this situation that don't involve putting yourself at risk." I touched her hand reassuringly, feeling the slight tremor in my own fingers that had nothing to do with poison and everything to do with anticipation. The risk was calculated, every variable accounted for, every contingency planned. Dr. Chen was among the guests, ready to provide immediate medical intervention if needed. Marcus Webb had positioned himself as event security, his cameras capturing every angle of what was about to unfold. My lawyer sat at table 3 with documents that would become relevant before the evening ended. Nathan knocked on the suite door with the particular rhythm he'd used throughout our marriage, a private code between spouses that now felt like a mockery. I nodded to Diana, who squeezed my shoulder before opening the door. My husband entered in his charcoal gray suit, the one he'd worn to our original wedding, looking every inch the devoted spouse preparing to publicly declare his eternal commitment. "You look beautiful," he said, his smile reaching his eyes in a way that might have fooled me months ago. "How are you feeling? Strong enough for this? I know how much strain you've been under with your health." The concern in his voice was masterful, pitched perfectly to sound genuine while subtly reminding me of my supposed fragility. I managed a wan smile, letting exhaustion show in the slight droop of my shoulder. "I wouldn't miss this for anything," I replied, injecting a note of brave determination into my voice. "Though I did take an extra dose of those vitamins you got me, just to be safe." His eyes sharpened at the mention of the vitamins, the supplements he'd been pushing more aggressively as my secret recovery threatened his timeline. "Good. Good. We want you to have energy for the ceremony. It would be a shame if you had one of your episodes during the vow." The threat was subtle but clear: play your part or face consequences. Diana excused herself with manufactured casualness, leaving Nathan and me alone for what he probably assumed would be our last private moment as husband and wife. He moved closer, adjusting my necklace with fingers that had mixed poison into my morning coffee countless times. "The sapphires are perfect with your dress," he murmured. "I want everyone to see how beautiful my wife is. How lucky I am to have survived these difficult months together." Survive. The word choice was so precisely cruel I almost admired it. He was already crafting the narrative of the grieving widower, the man who'd stood by his sick wife until the end. I wondered if he'd practiced his eulogy yet, if he and Rachel had discussed what an appropriate mourning period would look like before they went public with their relationship. The ballroom was exactly as I'd requested. Round tables draped in ivory linens, centerpieces of white roses and baby's breath that would photograph beautifully for the tragedy to come. Our families mingled with carefully selected friends. A guest list I'd curated to include everyone who'd witnessed my decline these past months. They needed to be here for what came next. Witnesses to a truth more shocking than anything they could imagine. My mother held court at the family table, her expression pinched with the familiar disapproval she'd worn throughout my illness. She'd been one of Nathan's strongest allies, constantly suggesting my symptoms were psychosomatic, that I was being dramatic, that I should be grateful for such a patient husband. Watching her fawn over Nathan as he worked the room, I wondered how quickly her allegiance would shift when the truth emerged. Rachel arrived precisely on time, wearing a dress just slightly too formal for a vow renewal guest, as if she'd dressed for a more significant occasion. Nathan had insisted we invite her, claiming it would seem odd to exclude a colleague he worked so closely with. I'd agreed readily, knowing her presence was essential for what I'd planned. She took her assigned seat at table 7, positioned with a clear view of the head table where Nathan and I would sit. The ceremony itself was brief but loaded with irony. Nathan had written new vows for the occasion, speaking of partnership through adversity, of love that endured through sickness and health. His voice carried perfectly through the ballroom's acoustics, each word a testament to his skill at public deception. When my turn came, I kept my vows simple, speaking of truth, justice and the unexpected ways love could transform over time. Nathan squeezed my hand at what he interpreted as romantic sentiment, unaware I was speaking of transformation from love to survival instinct. As we were pronounced renewed in our commitment, the room erupted in applause. Nathan kissed me with choreographed passion, his lips tasting faintly of the breath mints he'd eaten to cover any trace of alcohol. He'd been notably abstaining all evening, claiming solidarity with my health restrictions. The real reason, I knew, was to keep his senses sharp for what he planned to do next. The reception began with the traditional toast. Nathan's brother James, our original best man, spoke of commitment and perseverance. My sister Lucy, who'd flown in from Portland, tearfully described how Nathan's devotion during my illness had restored her faith in marriage. Each speech reinforced the narrative Nathan had so carefully constructed, the perfect husband standing by his failing wife. I smiled and dabbed at my eyes at appropriate moments, playing my part in the tableau. Then came the moment everything had been building toward. Nathan rose for his toast, champagne flute in hand, his expression radiating the perfect blend of love and sorrow. The servers had already distributed glasses to all the guests, the champagne Nathan had specifically selected for its strong flavor profile that would mask any addition. I watched him closely, noting the slight pat of his jacket pocket where I knew the vial rested. Before we drank, he began, his voice carrying that practiced emotional tremor. I want to say something about the woman I married 8 years ago. Veronica came into my life like a force of nature, brilliant and creative and so full of life it took my breath away. These past months have been difficult, watching that light dim as she's struggled with her health. But tonight, seeing her here, fighting to celebrate our love despite everything, I'm reminded that true partnership means standing together even in the darkest moments. The room was silent except for the soft sniffle of emotional guests. Nathan continued his performance, each word calculated to establish his devotion before my anticipated decline. He spoke of hopes for my recovery, of faith in medical science, of refusing to give up even when things seemed hopeless. It was a eulogy disguised as a toast, and everyone was too moved to notice. As he spoke, his free hand drifted to his pocket. The movement was smooth, practiced, barely noticeable unless you were watching for it. The vial appeared for just a moment as he turned slightly away from the crowd, ostensibly overcome with emotion. His thumb flicked the cap, and clear liquid dripped into my waiting champagne glass as he reached for it, preparing to hand it to me for our unified toast. This was the moment I'd prepared for, the culmination of weeks of planning. As Nathan turned back to face me, my champagne glass now in his hand, I stood with apparent difficulty, my own movements calculated to draw every eye. "My darling," I said, my voice carrying surprising strength. Before we drink, I have something to say as well. Nathan's smile flickered uncertainty. This wasn't in the script. I wasn't supposed to speak beyond accepting his tone. But he couldn't protest without seeming churlish, so he nodded encouragingly while his eyes warned me to keep it brief. I reached for the microphone, my other hand pressing against the table as if for support. 8 years ago, I married a man I thought I knew completely. These past months have taught me how wrong I was. I've discovered depths to Nathan I never imagined existed, complexities in his character that have transformed my understanding of our marriage. The words were carefully chosen, true in ways the audience couldn't yet comprehend. Nathan's expression relaxed slightly, interpreting my speech as a tribute to his supposed caregiving. Behind him, I caught Rachel shifting in her seat, perhaps sensing an undercurrent she couldn't quite identify. They say crisis reveals character, I continued, my voice growing stronger. And I've learned so much about character lately, about the lengths people will go to for love, for money, for freedom, about how appearances can deceive and how the person sleeping beside you can harbor secrets that would stop your heart if you knew them. Now Nathan's smile was forced, his eyes darting between me and the crowd. I could see him calculating whether to interrupt, to play the concerned husband worried about my overwrought state, but the guests were leaning in, captivated by what they perceived as raw emotion from a sick woman. So before we drink to our renewed commitment, I said, reaching for my champagne glass while maintaining eye contact with Nathan, I want to propose a different toast, to truth, to justice, and to the understanding that some betrayals run so deep they poison everything they touch. I lifted my glass, the champagne Nathan had so carefully dosed, catching the light. The room held its breath, waiting for the romantic conclusion to what seemed like an emotionally charged moment. Nathan raised his own glass reflexively, trapped by social convention and the watching crowd. But at the last second I paused. Actually, I said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes, I've been having trouble with champagne lately. My medication, you understand. Nathan, darling, would you mind terribly if we switched? I know you selected this vintage especially for tonight. I'd hate for your choice to go unappreciated. The color drained from Nathan's face so quickly that several guests noticed, interpreting it as concern for my health. His hand holding my dosed glass trembled slightly, the first crack in his perfect facade. We couldn't switch, he said, his voice slightly too high. This glass is yours. I had them prepare it specially for you, with your dietary restrictions in mind. How thoughtful, I replied, setting down the glass I held. But then again, you've always been so careful about what I consume, so protective of my health. Some might say obsessively so. Veronica, Nathan's voice carried a warning now, barely concealed beneath manufactured concern. You're not feeling well. Perhaps we should sit down. Oh, but I'm feeling better than I have in months, I said, turning to address the room. Amazing what proper medical care can do when you finally get it. Dr. Chen has been wonderful. She discovered the most interesting things about my condition. Dr. Chen stood from her table on cue, her presence lending medical authority to what was about to unfold. Several guests murmured, recognizing her from medical conferences and publications. Nathan's grip on the champagne glass tightened until his knuckles went white. For instance, I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the now silent ballroom, she discovered that my mysterious illness wasn't so mysterious after all. Chronic poisoning, she called it. Small doses over time, designed to mimic autoimmune disorders. Quite clever, really. The kind of thing that would require specific knowledge of biochemistry to accomplish. The murmur that ran through the crowd was no longer sympathetic, but shocked. Nathan tried to speak, but I raised my hand, commanding silence with a gesture that belonged to the woman I'd been before he'd tried to kill me. Now I'm not saying my devoted husband has been poisoning me, I said with calculated calm. That would be a terrible accusation to make without proof. But isn't it interesting that my symptoms always worsen after meals he prepares, that my health improved dramatically once I started avoiding his cooking, that the man with access to biochemical compounds through his work has a wife suffering from exactly the kind of illness those compounds could cause. Veronica, stop. Nathan's mask had slipped completely now, revealing something desperate and dangerous beneath. You're having an episode. You need medical attention. What I need, I said, picking up the champagne glass he'd dosed, is for everyone to understand what's been happening in this marriage. What I need is for Rachel Morrison to know exactly what kind of man she's been planning a future with. Rachel's audible gasp confirmed what everyone had begun to suspect. She half rose from her chair as if to flee, but Marcus Webb had positioned himself behind her table, his presence subtle but effective. She sank back down, her face a study in growing horror. Nathan made one last attempt at control. "These are the delusions we've been dealing with," he announced to the room, trying to reclaim the narrative. "My wife's illness has affected her mind. She's been paranoid, making wild accusations. I should have insisted on hospitalization, but I wanted to give her this day, this chance to—" "To what?" I interrupted. "To poison me one last time before your conference." "Oh yes, I know about the timeline. May was always the target, wasn't it? Your alibi trip to Vancouver while I conveniently died at home, except the conference got moved up, so you had to accelerate things. Hence tonight's special champagne." I held up the glass, studying it in the light. "Tell me, Nathan, if I'm so delusional, would you drink this? It's just champagne, after all, your specially selected vintage. Surely there's nothing wrong with it." The challenge hung in the air like a blade. Nathan stared at the glass in my hand, then at the crowd of witnesses, calculating odds that were rapidly turning against him. His silence spoke volumes, confirming guilt more effectively than any confession. "But I'm not cruel," I continued, my voice hardening. "I won't force you to drink poison, even though you've forced it on me for months. Instead, let's give it to someone who truly deserves to share in your plan. Rachel, would you join us for a toast? After all, you've been so invested in our marriage outcome." Rachel's cry of protest was cut short, as I began walking toward her table, the dosed champagne glass held like a weapon. Nathan lunged forward, trying to intercept me, his sudden movement knocking over glasses and sending shimmers of champagne across the white tablecloth. His desperation to stop me from reaching Rachel was the final confirmation anyone needed. "Don't let her drink that," he shouted, all pretense abandoned. "It's not safe. I had to. She was supposed to." The confession tumbled out in fragments as Nathan realized the impossibility of his position. He couldn't let Rachel drink the poisoned champagne without revealing his crime, but stopping me confirmed everything I'd accused him of. The man who'd planned every detail of my murder had failed to account for the possibility that I might discover his scheme and turn it against him. Marcus Webb stepped forward then, his security credentials replaced by FBI identification. The other agents I'd noticed scattered through the crowd revealed themselves, moving to block exits and isolate key players. Nathan's expression cycled through shock, rage, and finally a kind of resigned defeat as he understood how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. The arrest happened quickly, professionally, with minimal disruption despite the dramatic circumstance. Nathan didn't struggle as they cuffed him, his gaze fixed on me with a mixture of hatred and bewilderment. Even then, he couldn't quite comprehend how his perfect victim had become his prosecutor. Rachel's arrest followed moments later, her protests of innocence silenced by the evidence Marcus's team had gathered from her devices and communications. The careful planning, the researched timelines, the future she'd mapped out over my dead body, all documented in damning detail. She'd thought herself clever using draft emails and coded messages, never realizing that investigators who knew what to look for could unravel any disguise. As they led Nathan past me, he stopped for a moment, the agents allowing this final exchange. "What?" he asked, the question seemingly encompassing everything from my discovery of his plot to my decision to expose him so publicly. I could have given him a dozen answers, because I refused to be a victim, because justice demanded it, because the woman he'd tried to kill was stronger than the one he'd married. But in the end, I gave him the simplest truth. "Because you taught me," I said quietly. "Every poisoned cup, every doctored meal, every lie, disguised as love, you taught me that the most dangerous toxins come from the people we trust most. I simply learned your lessons better than you expected." The ballroom erupted in chaos as the arrests concluded, guests struggling to process the transformation of a vow renewal into a crime scene. Through it all, I stood calmly in my ivory dress, holding a champagne glass full of evidence,
finally free of the poison that had been killing me slowly for months. The aftermath unfolded with the kind of media attention that would have horrified the old Veronica, the one who'd valued privacy and propriety above all else. But surviving attempted murder changes your priority. I gave interviews selectively, working with prosecutors to ensure the case against Nathan and Rachel was airtight. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records, laboratory access logs, the poisons found in Nathan's possession, and Rachel's detailed planning documents all painted a picture of premeditated murder, motivated by greed and desire. The trial became Seattle's most sensational case in years. Nathan's biotech firm distanced themselves immediately, claiming shock at his actions, while quietly conducting internal reviews of laboratory security. Rachel's marketing career ended overnight, her Harvard MBA worthless in the face of conspiracy to commit murder charges. They tried to turn on each other as the pressure mounted, each claiming the other had masterminded the plot, but the evidence showed clear collaboration from the beginning. My mother's reaction had been perhaps the most painful secondary wound. Faced with proof of Nathan's crimes, she'd pivoted from defending him to claiming she'd always sensed something was wrong, rewriting history to cast herself as protective rather than dismissive. Our relationship, already strained by her lack of support during my illness, never fully recovered. Some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness, even from family. Diana, by contrast, had been my rock throughout the legal proceedings. She'd moved into my house temporarily after Nathan's arrest, helping me reclaim spaces that had been tainted by months of systematic poisoning. Together we'd cleaned out his office, finding more evidence of his cold calculation, spreadsheets tracking my symptoms, research on untraceable poisons, even draft obituaries he'd been refining for months. The house itself became a problem I hadn't anticipated. Every room held memories of attempted murder disguised as marital care: the kitchen where he'd prepared poisoned meals, the bedroom where he'd lain beside me planning my death, the dining room where we'd shared contaminated wine. All of it felt toxic in ways that had nothing to do with chemical. I'd won the house in the divorce proceedings, along with most of our assets, once the attempted murder charges were factored in, but victory felt hollow in a home that had nearly become my tomb. The solution came from an unexpected source. My grandmother's estate in Bellevue, empty since her death 5 years ago, offered a fresh start. I'd inherited it but never moved in, unwilling to leave the life Nathan and I had built together. Now, with that life revealed as a carefully constructed death trap, my grandmother's home felt like salvation. I moved in 3 months after the arrest, bringing nothing from the old house except photographs from before my marriage, and the jewelry that had been gifts from family rather than Nathan. Dr. Chen continued treating me through the recovery process, helping my body heal from months of poison while documenting every aspect for the trial. The physical recovery was actually easier than the psychological aftermath. Trust, once shattered so fundamentally, proved difficult to rebuild.
I found myself checking drinks for strange tastes, hesitating before meals. I hadn't prepared myself, startling when anyone moved too quickly near my food. The hypervigilance was exhausting but necessary. My body's way of protecting itself from threats, my mind had been too slow to recognize. The trial date approached like a storm system on weather radar, inevitable and ominous. The prosecution had built an ironclad case, but Nathan's defense team was expensive and creative, hired with family money his mother had reluctantly provided. They couldn't dispute the evidence, so they attacked my credibility instead. The mental health issues I'd supposedly experienced during my poisoning became their weapon, painting me as an unreliable witness to my own attempted murder. The strategy might have worked if not for the meticulous documentation I'd maintained. My secret journal, authenticated by handwriting experts, showed clear correlation between Nathan's meal preparations and my symptoms. The security footage Marcus had obtained revealed Nathan entering restricted laboratory areas at times that corresponded with my worst episodes. Most damning, they'd found the vial in his jacket pocket at the arrest, still containing traces of the compound he'd been dosing me with. Rachel's defense took a different approach, claiming she'd been manipulated by Nathan, an innocent woman caught up in a sociopath's web. The performance might have been more convincing if not for her own written plans discovered during the investigation. She'd researched inheritance law, life insurance payouts, and remarkably, wedding venues for a ceremony planned 6 months after my projected death. The callousness of planning their future over my theoretical grave shocked even seasoned court observers. Taking the stand was simultaneously the hardest and most empowering moment of the entire ordeal. Nathan watched from the defendant's table as I detailed months of poisoning, his expression cycling between feigned concern and barely concealed rage. His attorney tried to shake my testimony, suggesting my symptoms had been psychosomatic, that I'd misinterpreted normal marital tensions as something sinister. But the evidence supported every word, and the jury saw through the desperate attempts to discredit me. The most powerful moment came when the prosecution presented the champagne glass from the vow renewal, still containing the dose Nathan had intended as potentially my last. The chemical analysis matched perfectly with the compounds found in my system, the concentration high enough to cause severe symptoms or worse. Nathan's attorney had no response to such concrete evidence, and Nathan himself finally showed genuine emotion, not remorse, but frustration at being caught. The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation, guilty on all counts for both defendants. Attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, and a host of lesser charges that would ensure neither Nathan nor Rachel would threaten anyone again for a very long time. Nathan received 25 years, Rachel 15 as an accomplice. The sentences felt both too long and not long enough, measuring justice against months of calculated cruelty. The civil proceedings followed, quieter but equally important. The divorce had been straightforward given the criminal convictions, but there were still financial matters to resolve. Nathan's assets, including his biotech stock options, transferred to me as compensation for attempted murder. Rachel's assets were minimal, but the symbolic victory of bankrupting the woman who'd planned to profit from my death carried its own satisfaction. 6 months after the verdict, I finally felt ready to reclaim my life fully. The interior design firm I'd neglected during the poisoning and trial needed attention, and throwing myself into creative work proved therapeutic. My first major project after returning was redesigning a women's shelter, creating safe spaces for those escaping dangerous relationships. The parallels weren't lost on me, and I poured my understanding of survival into every room, every chosen color, every carefully planned exit route. The shelter's director, a woman named Patricia who'd survived her own attempted murder years ago, became an unexpected friend. She understood the specific trauma of discovering someone you loved wanted you dead, the way it rewired your brain's threat detection, the guilt of not seeing it sooner, the complex grief of mourning a relationship that had been trying to kill you. Our coffee meetings became impromptu therapy sessions, 2 survivors comparing notes on rebuilding after betrayal. The anniversary of the vow renewal approached with complicated emotion. The date marked both my greatest vulnerability and my greatest triumph, the night I'd nearly died and the night I'd seized control of my own narrative. Diana suggested celebrating with a party, reclaiming the date with positive associations, but that felt wrong. Instead, I spent the evening alone in my grandmother's garden, planting rosebushes that would bloom every spring, living reminders that I'd survived to see another season. The news of Nathan's prison assault came through his attorney, who contacted me about potentially testifying at his medical parole hearing. Apparently, other inmates had taken exception to a man who'd poisoned his wife, and Nathan had learned that attempted murder carried consequences beyond legal sentences. I felt no satisfaction in his injury, but also no sympathy. The man who'd carefully calculated my suffering for months deserved no consideration from me. I declined to testify, letting the parole board decide his fate without my input. Rachel's situation proved more pathetic than tragic. Her letters from prison forwarded through my attorney painted a picture of complete delusion. She still seemed to believe she was somehow a victim, that loving Nathan justified planning my murder, that she deserved forgiveness because she'd never personally administered the poison. I never responded, filing the letters as evidence of her continued lack of remorse. Some people I'd learned were incapable of acknowledging their own monstrosity. The financial settlement from the civil case finally cleared 18 months after the criminal verdict. The amount was substantial enough to ensure I'd never need to work again, though work had become my anchor during recovery. I established a foundation for victims of intimate partner violence, focusing on those whose abuse had been subtle, systematic, or hard to prove. The Survivor's Trust, as I named it, provided legal resources, private investigation services, and safe housing for those discovering their partners were dangerous. The first grant went to a woman whose husband had been drugging her with sedatives, gaslighting her about memory loss while systematically stealing her inheritance. The second helped a man whose wife had been slowly introducing allergens into his food, hoping to trigger a fatal reaction that would look accidental. Each case reinforced how lucky I'd been to discover Nathan's plot before it succeeded. How many victims never got the chance to switch the poisoned glass. 2 years after the arrest, I finally felt ready to attempt dating again. The process was terrifying. Each potential partner filtered through hard-won paranoia. Dr. Chen had recommended a therapist who specialized in betrayal trauma, and together we'd worked on distinguishing reasonable caution from crippling fear. The first few dates were disasters, my hypervigilance making normal interaction impossible, but gradually, I learned to navigate the balance between protection and possibility. Marcus Webb, who'd transitioned from investigator to friend during the trial, introduced me to his colleague Daniel Kim, a forensic accountant who'd helped trace Nathan's hidden assets. Daniel understood my story without requiring constant explanation. Our first date was coffee in a public place with exits I'd mapped beforehand, both of us laughing at the absurdity of my security measures, while acknowledging their necessity. He didn't take offense when I insisted on ordering my own drink, watching it prepared, maintaining control over what I consumed. The relationship developed slowly, built on transparency and verified trust rather than the whirlwind romance Nathan had orchestrated years ago. Daniel submitted to background checks without complaint, understood when I needed space, never pushed for overnight stays until I was ready. His patience came from his own experiences investigating financial crimes, seeing how predators used trust as a weapon. He knew better than to rush someone who'd been systematically betrayed. 3 years after that horrible night at the Fairmont, I stood in the same ballroom for a different event. The Survivors Trust was hosting its first major fundraiser, bringing together donors, survivors, and advocates for an evening of hope rather than horror. I'd specifically requested this venue, needing to overwrite those memories with something positive. The champagne served was from a different vintage, each bottle opened in full view of guests, a small accommodation to my permanent vigilance. Patricia spoke about the shelter expansions funded by the trust. Dr. Chen presented on recognizing signs of systematic poisoning. Marcus outlined investigative resources available to those suspecting partner violence. But the most powerful moment came from a surprise speaker, Nathan's mother, Eleanor Morrison. She approached me before going on stage, her usual imperial bearing replaced by something humbler. "I've lived with the knowledge that I raised a monster," she said quietly, "that I defended him while he was killing you. I can't undo that, but I can use my resources to prevent other mothers from making my mistake." Her donation to the trust was substantial, but more importantly, she'd become an advocate for believing victims. Her speech that night was raw, acknowledging her complicity in dismissing my symptoms, her role in enabling Nathan's behavior. The audience sat in stunned silence, as Seattle society's grande dame admitted to catastrophic failure in protecting her daughter-in-law. It didn't heal our relationship, but it marked a kind of progress. The fundraiser exceeded all goals, securing funding for 3 new safe houses and expanded legal services. But for me, the victory was more personal. I'd stood in the space where Nathan had tried to kill me, and felt not fear but power. The room that had nearly been my last was now filled with people committed to preventing similar tragedies. The poisoned champagne had been replaced by hope and resources for survival. As the evening concluded, Daniel found me on the same terrace where I'd once hidden from Nathan's suffocating attention. The city lights sparkled below us, Seattle's beauty undiminished by the darkness I'd survived within it. He didn't speak, just stood beside me, his presence solid and unthreatening. We'd been together over a year by then, carefully building something real on the ruins of what had been false. I thought about Nathan in his prison cell, about Rachel serving her time, about the life they'd planned to build on my grave. They'd failed, but their failure had transformed me in ways they'd never intended. The woman who'd trustingly drunk poisoned coffee each morning had evolved into someone who could recognize danger, document truth, and transform victimization into victory. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the one I'd claimed through survival. The Fairmont's ballroom held no more ghost for me. The champagne could be enjoyed without fear. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but unpoisoned. And somewhere in the Washington State correctional system, Nathan was learning that some toasts, once raised, couldn't be taken back. The glasses had been switched, the poison redirected, and the intended victim had become the victor. It was, I thought, as Daniel and I headed home to the life I'd built from the ashes of attempted murder, a perfectly balanced ending. But endings, I'd learned, were really just beginnings viewed from a different angle, and this beginning, born from poison and betrayal, had transformed into something unexpectedly beautiful. The woman who'd almost died at the Fairmont had been replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more careful about what she allowed into her glass and into her life. Nathan had tried to write my ending with poison. Instead, he'd given me the materials to write a completely different story, one where the intended victim raised the final toast. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning 5 years after Nathan's conviction, delivered by courier to my office at the design firm. The return address showed the Washington State Correctional Facility, but the handwriting wasn't Nathan's. Inside, a single sheet of paper contained a message that made my blood run cold despite the years of healing between us. Mrs. Chen, I believe you should know that your ex-husband has been corresponding with someone on the outside who claims to be planning to finish what he started. I cannot reveal my identity, but I felt you deserved a warning. Be careful. A friend. Daniel found me sitting at my desk 20 minutes later, the letter clutched in trembling hands. Without a word, he called Marcus Webb, who arrived within the hour with a team ready to investigate this new threat. The safety I'd painstakingly rebuilt suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass, ready to shatter at the slightest pressure. The investigation revealed a disturbing truth. Nathan had indeed been corresponding with a woman named Sylvia Marsh, a prison groupie who'd become obsessed with his case. Their letters, obtained through legal channels, showed an escalating fantasy where she would complete his work and they would be together after his release. Nathan, true to form, was manipulating her delusions, while maintaining plausible deniability in case authorities discovered their communication. Marcus's team worked with exceptional efficiency, tracking Sylvia's movements and discovering she'd recently relocated to Seattle. She'd been asking questions about me at industry events, presenting herself as a potential client interested in my design work. The reconnaissance felt horrifyingly familiar, another predator circling while I remained unaware of the danger. But I wasn't the same woman who'd missed Nathan's poison in her coffee. The years had taught me vigilance, and the network I'd built through the Survivors Trust provided resources the old Veronica could never have accessed. Within days, we had comprehensive intelligence on Sylvia Marsh, her background, her capabilities, her whereabouts, and most importantly, her plans. The confrontation came at a charity auction where I was presenting a design concept for a new women's shelter. Sylvia approached during the cocktail hour, her appearance so ordinary it was almost disappointing. Medium height, brown hair, the kind of face that would disappear in a crowd, but her eyes held the same calculated coldness I'd finally recognized in Nathan's, the look of someone who could plan murder while making small talk. "Miss Chen," she said, extending her hand with a smile that didn't reach those calculating eyes, "I've been hoping to meet you. I'm very interested in your work." I took her hand, my security detail positioned discreetly around the room, every exit covered, every drink and plate monitored. "I'm always happy to discuss potential projects," I replied, matching her false warmth. "Though I should mention I'm very selective about my clients these days. I only work with people I can trust completely." Her smile flickered at the emphasis on trust. Of course, trust is everything in business relationships, and in personal ones. Some people, though, they don't deserve the trust they're given. They poison it. The word choice was deliberate, testing. I felt Daniel tense beside me, but I touched his arm lightly, a signal to let this play out. "Indeed," I agreed, "which is why I'm so careful now about what I allow into my life. Every project, every person, every interaction, all carefully vetted. You'd be amazed what a good investigator can uncover about someone's intentions." Sylvia's facade cracked slightly, uncertainty creeping into her expression. She'd expected to find the same trusting victim Nathan had described in his letters. Instead, she'd encountered someone who clearly knew exactly who she was and why she was there. the predator suddenly felt like prey, and she didn't know how to process the reverse. For instance, I continued conversationally, I know you've been corresponding with my ex-husband. I know about your plans to finish what he started. I even know about the chemistry degree you earned before your psychological issues led to your dismissal from graduate school. Quite similar to Nathan's background, actually. Perhaps that's what drew you to him, a shared interest in pharmaceutical solutions to personal problems. The color drained from her face as she realized the scope of my knowledge. Around us, the charity auction continued, oblivious to the quiet confrontation happening in their midst. But my security team was ready, and law enforcement was already moving into position outside, waiting for my signal. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice gentle but implacable. You're going to leave this event immediately. You're going to return to whatever hole you crawled out of, and you're going to forget Nathan Morrison exists. Because if you don't, if you take even one step toward actualizing your pathetic murder fantasies, you'll discover that surviving one attempted killing taught me everything I need to know about preventing another. She tried to speak, but I raised my hand, silencing her. The authorities are already aware of your activities. Your correspondence with Nathan is being reviewed for criminal conspiracy charges. Your recent chemical purchases have been flagged. Your rental car has been tracked. You have no moves left to make except retreat, so I suggest you make. Sylvia's retreat was hasty and complete. Within a week she'd left Washington State entirely, her dreams of becoming Nathan's avenging angel, shattered by the reality that I was no longer anyone's victim. The authorities continued monitoring her, but she seemed to have learned what Nathan never did, that some targets are too dangerous to pursue. The incident served as a reminder that Nathan's poison would continue attempting to seep into my life from unexpected directions. But it also proved that I'd developed an immunity not just to physical toxins, but to the psychological ones as well. The woman who'd once drunk poisoned coffee without question had evolved into someone who could identify threats before they fully materialized and neutralize them without violence or drama. Life continued with its strange mixture of normal moments and necessary vigilance. Daniel and I married in a small ceremony at my grandmother's estate, surrounded by people who'd proven their loyalty through actions rather than words. We exchanged rings in the garden, where I'd planted those rose bushes years ago, their blooms a testament to survival and growth. Dr. Chen served as my maid of honor, Patricia officiated, and Marcus provided security that was discreet but comprehensive. The survivors' trust expanded beyond anything I'd originally envisioned. We opened facilities in 3 states, providing not just shelter but comprehensive support for those escaping systematic abuse. Each success story felt like a small victory against the Nathans of the world. Proof that predators didn't always win, that victims could transform into survivors and then into thrivers. Nathan himself became increasingly irrelevant to my daily life. His letters from prison, forwarded through official channels, went unread and eventually stopped coming. Reports filtered through occasionally, an illness here, a disciplinary action there, but they registered as distant echoes of a past I'd transcended. He'd wanted to be the author of my ending, but instead had become barely a footnote in my ongoing story. The final letter I received about Nathan came from Eleanor Morrison on a rain-soaked Thursday 10 years after the poisoning began. Her handwriting, once imperious, now showed the shakiness of age and perhaps conscience. She wrote to inform me that Nathan had died in prison, a sudden heart attack that the medical examiner deemed natural cause. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The man who'd tried to disguise murder as natural illness had succumbed to an actual one. I felt no celebration at the news, just a quiet closing of a chapter that had already ended for me years ago. Nathan had been dead to me since the moment I'd discovered his betrayal. His physical death simply aligned reality with what had been emotionally true for a decade. I sent Eleanor a brief response, acknowledging receipt of her letter and wishing her peace. Some bridges, once burned, didn't need rebuilding, but they also didn't require continued hostility. Rachel's fate proved more pathetic than tragic. Released after serving 12 years, she attempted to rebuild her life but found the world had little sympathy for someone who'd planned murder for love. The last I heard, she was working retail in a small town in Montana, her Harvard MBA,
and marketing expertise useless in a world that had Googled her name. Sometimes the best revenge truly was living well while your enemies lived with the consequences of their choices. As I write this, 15 years have passed since that night at the Fairmont when I switched the glasses and reclaimed my power. The woman who nearly drank poison from her husband's hand has become someone entirely different, stronger, wiser, infinitely more careful, but not paralyzed by fear. I still check my drinks, still prefer preparing my own meals, still maintain security measures that might seem excessive to those who've never been betrayed so fundamentally. But these precautions have become background noise to a life filled with purpose, love, and the particular joy that comes from surviving what should have killed you. The Survivors Trust has helped hundreds of people recognize and escape their own poison situation. My design firm has created beautiful, safe spaces for those rebuilding after trauma. My marriage to Daniel has proven that trust, while forever changed by betrayal, can still exist in careful, verified form. Even my relationship with food and drink, so damaged by Nathan's weaponization of nourishment, has healed into something sustainable if still cautious. Sometimes I think about that moment in the restaurant, watching Nathan prepare to toast our renewed vows with champagne he'd poisoned for me. The split-second decision to switch the glasses changed everything, not just saving my life but setting in motion the complete reversal of predator and prey. He'd thought he was directing the performance, but I'd rewritten the script entirely. The glass meant for me had become the evidence that convicted him, the proof that transformed victim into victor. The champagne flute sits in my office now, sealed in a display case with a small placard that simply reads, Visitors often ask about it, and I tell them the story not as a tragedy but as a testament to intuition, investigation, and the power of turning someone's weapon against them. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the best response to poison isn't an antidote, but a redirect, sending the toxin back to its source. Nathan had tried to write my ending with systematic poisoning disguised as love. Instead, he'd given me the raw materials for an entirely different story, one where the intended victim not only survived but thrived, building an empire of survival from the ashes of attempted murder. He'd wanted to dissolve me slowly, imperceptibly, until nothing remained but his freedom to start fresh with Rachel. But dissolution, I'd learned, could be reversed. What poison had tried to break down, determination had rebuilt stronger. The final toast, the one that truly mattered, came at the 10-year anniversary gala for the Survivors Trust. Hundreds of survivors, supporters, and advocates gathered to celebrate a decade of transforming trauma into triumph. I raised my glass, contents, verified, preparation, witnessed, safety assured, but no longer paralyzing, and offered words Nathan never expected me to live to speak. To survival, I said, my voice carrying across the room, to recognition of danger, and the courage to confront it. To switching the glasses when someone tries to poison us, literally, or metaphorically, and to the beautiful truth that those who try to destroy us often provide the very tools for our transformation. The room erupted in applause, survivors recognizing their own stories in mine. As I sipped my champagne, safe, verified, untainted, I thought about the journey from that first bitter tasting coffee to this moment of triumph. Nathan had been right about one thing: poison could transform everything it touched. He just hadn't realized that transformation could flow in directions he never intended, creating not death, but rebirth, not endings, but beginnings, not victims, but victors, who knew exactly what to do when someone handed them a poisoned glass. The glasses had been switched, the poison redirected, the story rewritten, and the woman who'd almost died from trusting too much had learned to trust again, carefully, wisely, but genuinely. It was, I thought as I looked out at the room full of survivors, building new lives from the ashes of abuse, the perfect ending to a story that had tried to conclude with poison, but ended instead with power. Nathan was gone, Rachel was irrelevant, but I remained, no longer defined by what they'd tried to do to me, but by what I'd built from the wreckage of their plans. The poisoned champagne had become a symbol, not of death, but of recognition, reversal, and ultimately, renewal. Some toasts, I'd learned, were worth switching, and some stories, no matter how they began, deserved endings their villains never saw coming. Up next, you've got two more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, You won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.